done with housekeeping issues, now to business. There are two of us. My name is Katya Kudryavtseva, and I'm curator of the Vera Blumner Kuba collection. And I will talk about the concept of the exhibition and about Blumner and, whether we can consider his art to be politically engaged. And then, of course, Lusa, who is politically engaged, will talk about her projects. Okay, so let me start. As a curator of this collection, my deep dive into the collection started in spring 2021. Then I was invited as a guest curator to do an exhibition on exhibition history of Blumner at Stetson. And actually, at this moment, it made me realize for the first time, even though I'm an art historian and I understand the value of Blumner and everything, like what kind of significant collection we have in our possession. So I was going, as a part of that exhibit, I was going through every single show that was mounted at Stetson. Yeah, you don't need to read it, just, be impressed. Okay, so most of those exhibitions were curated by Dr. Roberta Favis. And again, reading her pamphlets that she created for the exhibition, I actually also realized her enormous contribution to Blumner studies. It's actually a fun fact. Roberta was specializing in northern painting, right? But then this collection became part of Stetson, and she got appointed as a curator of the collection. She became one of the most important Blumner scholars in the world, truly, an expert, right? So at this point, Roberta actually retired, and Hand Art Center was going through guest curators. And after I was done with that exhibition, I realized that actually we need a permanent curator, right, to have a vision for the collection, to develop it. So I wrote a proposal, and actually, to my surprise, I received full support of the Dean and now Provost Elizabeth Scamp, and I was appointed as a curator. But of course, it wasn't that easy because there are proposals, there are drafts, there are back and forth. And she wanted me basically to provide a vision for future exhibitions. And I kept returning to a show that I saw at Stetson, a show that was curated and created by Madison Creech, who was a visiting professor in digital arts here. Okay, so she played this dual role for this exhibition, as she was both the curator and the artist. So what she did, she harvested images from the Vogue archive, and she created textiles and wallpapers to exhibit Blumner paintings. Interestingly enough, she was absolutely sure that I would hate it because it was not art historical, right? There are no text panels or horror and all of that. But I was absolutely mesmerized and fell in love with that because, for the first time, you see something so familiar after years and years of exhibition presented in this totally different light. Right? So what Madison's exhibition did, it opened a possibility of a dialogue between Blumner, a modernist painter, right, and contemporary artists. So as I was writing my proposal, I was thinking, you know what, I need to collaborate with artists. And it was a selfish thing, actually, because I thought, okay, artists, they can paint, they can come up with and realize, actually, an interesting exhibition design. Right? Now to the concept. So, as so many good things, the concept was born as Lucy and I were drinking wine in Miami. And we were complaining about Stetson, as always, people do, and we were talking about, you know, well, the appointment is not there, we're in negotiation. And then I said, well, you know, as I'm thinking about exhibitions, yeah, I think collaboration is the way. And then all of a sudden, Lucy said that, oh my, like, I would like to collaborate. So we had to come, so at this point, like, I'm not appointed, right? It's all like a conversation, basically. But nonetheless, then I got my appointment. We revisited that thing, and we just, you know, we were thinking about what it could be, right? And of course, I know that Luce's art is highly political, right? So it had to be about politics. And the only, like, and Blumner wrote a lot. But of course, he was much more interested in articulating a new visual language to reflect modernity rather than reacting to particular political events, right? So, but there was one point of convergence, right? And it was Patterson silk strike, you know, which, like the spirit of which is in many ways was reflected in Blumner's Patterson cycle, right? So, well, that didn't exist back then, right? So we were discussing, okay, so it should be something like that. And I mean, like each of us actually did independent research, right? Thinking about like how, like Lucy was thinking about like her process, her works, right? Because it's actually, it takes a lot to create a new body of work for one particular exhibition, right? And I was thinking what kind of Blumner's works out of 26 that we have, I would select and how it would mesh with like design and so forth. So, okay, so yeah, research. I'm not using Green's book because I saw your slides. So, so it's actually, you know, insane that you end up reading so many books, so many articles to write like, you know, 3 panels of text. But I mean, it's true, right? I can say that after concluding this project, I know quite a bit about American labor movement, which was never a part of my any type of interests, to tell you the truth. But so you do historical research, right? And of course you do art historical research. And Jeffrey Hayes, who was the author of the first monograph on Blumner, actually wrote a lot about Patterson cycle and the reception of those works by American art critics, right? And of course, Roberta Favis, the first curator of the collection, published a definitive article on the cycle in American Art magazine, where she actually, you know, analyzed the connections between, you know, different sketches and then finished paintings and the events that were happening in Patterson. And of course, Roberta also did an exhibition on Patterson. However, at this point, she wasn't talking much, like in her text, bold text, about this connection. But nonetheless, so it's not the first time that we're displaying those works at Stetson. Okay, city of Patterson. So as you can see, it's kind of a dreadful city because, well, I mean, we're talking about growing industrial city with over 300 factories, right? Many thousands of workers living there in tight quarters, right? I mean, the air is polluted and all of that. And it's actually, I think it's interesting that Blumner would select that type of location for his cycle. But anyway, so you have all these workers toiling away to create luxury goods for the moneyed elite. not much is changing, but you know, I love this, you know, these plates from American fashion magazines, right, that are promoting silk merchandise. It's actually interesting because as I was reading about the silk strike, at one point the workers were asked whether they possessed a silk gown, okay? And so of course, like nobody had that. And then one woman said, well, I have a silk dress. And then she explains how she got it. So her husband, who was working at the mill, he had an accident and he damaged a piece of silk fabric. So instead of salary, they gave him this damaged silk and she got to have this dress, right? And, you know, and it's interesting because as she was talking about it, she was not enraged by that. She said, but, you know, it's damaged, but, you know, I have this silk dress, right? The ultimate commodity that those workers produced and never got to own. Okay, so, so that's the city. And again, there are like multiple description of that city where everybody is talking about this particular, like, dreadful surroundings, because you have on one hand you have canals, you have this beautiful nature, right, but then you have workers housing that is less than aesthetically appealing, and you have these like brick factories. And Lunar actually was drawn to sites like that, as he writes, I prefer the intimate landscape of our common surroundings where town and country mingle, for we are in the habit to carry into them our feelings of pain and pleasure, our moods. In fact, nature with her own color combination causes our soul to vibrate and furnishes themes. Okay, so he's particularly interested in this mixture because, I mean, even in Patterson, like Lunar is notorious for actually going on location and sketching, because even though his art is becoming increasingly abstract, he's very afraid to lose this connection with observable surroundings, right? So it always with him starts with something that is tangible, concrete, and observable, right? So he could have just focused on the beauty of nature, right? I mean, literally, like if you turn around and, you know, this house, like all of that will disappear and you can just focus on the beauty of nature. But he doesn't do that, right? So clearly he has an interest. And also, if we look at the makeup of the city, it's also a city that has a huge immigrant population. And Blumner himself, a recent immigrant to the United States from Germany, certainly feels an affinity to the plight of those workers. Okay, so so this is a sketch, right, that he produced in 1911 before the strike. Right? And then later we will make a comparison how his approach, especially to color scheme, changes. Okay, strike. It's actually amazing because, okay, so you have this industrial city, you have that many factories and that many workers, so labor issues were always very urgent. But because those workers were divided, like they were divided on the level of skill, right? You have unskilled workers and skilled workers who earn very different type of salaries, right? You have ethnic divisions, right, between people who were native to America, and by native I mean they were born in the United States, and people like recent immigrants from like Jewish immigrants from Russia, Ukraine, Poland, and so forth, right, and Italian immigrants. So like normally, it would be very difficult to galvanize these different groups. But, well, in 1913, it was successful, right? And they all stood behind, even though the strike started because of the increase of the workload, but all those workers wanted an 8-hour work day, right? So that ultimately became a unifying slogan. And so again, Blumner is not directly referring to the struggles of the workers. But if we look at those two different sketches and the color palette and the way it changes, we can see notable difference, right? Well, first of all, notice the color red, right? I mean, this red, it's almost like hitting the flat surface. It creates this pulsating quality. I mean, it's still, right? I mean, he uses this beautiful blues and violets, right? So it's not a gloomy composition, but at the same time, color is not innocent, right? It's informed by something. And at this point, Patterson is called in every single newspaper as the Red City, right? It's like it became, it's like it used to be Silk City, right? Now it's Red City. And then you're using red to depict the city, you are messaging something, right? And then after Blumner makes a full transition from architecture to painting, and he absorbs the multiple trends of European modernism. He repaints a lot of his works, like completely scrapes them and then repaints them in this new aesthetics, right? And we are looking at Jersey steel mills, finished in between 16 and 17. And here we can see again this emphasis on red. Actually, he wrote, then he finished the painting based on that watercolor. He said, well, now it's all color, right? It's all about red. And of course, red color is not, for Blumner, color has an ability to communicate messages and feelings, right? So without like overtly proclaiming something, I support the workers' right, he's still messaging something, right? Okay, so, and still, like, you can ask me, right, okay, Katya, like, come on, right? How's that, right? Something like that is connected to that. And I just want to say that during that time, artists are debating what it means to be revolutionary, right? So to be revolutionary, you can certainly illustrate the revolution as it unfolds, right? The worker strikes, the political unrest and so forth. You can do that, certainly. But then again, as an artist, your goal, or the way at least Blumner and a lot of artists during the time, the way they saw that, no, actually what we should do as artists, it's not like if you want to do politics, then become a politician, right? But you can absorb like all those currents, right, and transform them into a new visual reality, right? And this is, what he does through simplification of forms, through imposing this grid-like order, through like disciplining nature and architectural environment in a particular way. And interestingly enough, we know that Blumner contemporaries certainly read those paintings in political terms. Here is a quote from American art critic Henry McBride. He, Blumner, used to live in New Jersey and saw many factories. Factories fastened upon his ego. He saw them red. His paintings of factory scenes were the most violent protest against the modern system that I have ever encounter, but the propagandists in them got the better of the poet, and they were hard. They had the potency as arguments of stones, right? So, like, for a contemporary spectator, we look at those images and they kind of festive, right? I mean, this red becomes, you know, it's not, red is not a color of revolution in a way. America did a lot to stop that association. So, for example, fun fact, American Labor Day is in September, while the Labor Day in Europe is 1st of May, which, by the way, strikers celebrated this Labor Day on 1st of May, right? And this tradition starts from a strike in American city, right? But, capitalism is unique in its ability to adapt and package everything. So, that's the strength of that system. So, right, so what we see, like McBride even called Blumner, right, propagandist, as if he is creating propaganda, which of course he is not. But that means that contemporaries actually saw a clear political engagement in those works. And then now, Lusa.
Thank you all so much for coming. I'm Lusa Molnar. There are 3 or 4 more seats up here. If anyone wants to come and sit down, please feel free to step forward. You're not interrupting us. I see a lot of new faces, so I'm curious if anyone here has not yet had a chance to see the show, if you wouldn't mind raising your hand if you have not seen the show yet. Okay, so that's a decent number of people. So I'm going to try to talk fairly quickly and do my brief version so that you have a little bit of time to step into the galleries and actually see the work. I haven't actually included any photographs of my paintings because they're next door and it's better seen in person. So I'll leave you some time to do that and some time for questions as well. So as Katja mentioned, when we first sort of brainstorming this show, we came up with this kind of core idea of the 1913 silk worker strike as a way of connecting Blumner's work and my work. So for several years, I've been working on work that, frankly, I have not viewed as that political. Katja does, and I think, it's there. It comes from genuine interest, and I think a lot of it is me working through my own identity in ways that ends up kind of reading as political. But it was sort of a struggle for me at first to find ways to kind of connect Blumner's work that I enjoy and see a lot of value in, but feels really different from mine. So the starting point of this strike was really interesting for me. And some of the research that was really key for me was this book by Martin Green, which connected the Armory Show, which was, some of you might be familiar with it. It's now, the Armory Show is kind of a long-standing tradition in New York. But the first one happened in 1913 and brought a lot of modern art to the US for the first time. And it was sort of, it was this like huge surprise for American audiences that people were making work like nude descending a staircase on the cover of this book that was really different than kind of the traditional art that they were seeing. So it was a really big event. And the Armory Show was happening in the midst of the Patterson strike. So there's this kind of enormous correlation between this kind of art historical intellectual elite and these strikers. And those kind of connections I started to dig down into and really became an important kind of part of this project for me. So these are 2 figures that show up in the paintings that are connected in different ways. So in the center is Bill Haywood, who was a major organizer for the IWW, which was one of the major labor groups that was responsible for the strike and responsible for a lot of textile strikes in the US during this time period. He was kind of this mythic cowboy Western figure who kind of had a lot of political power and really was able to rally people behind him. And then here on the right-hand side is Mabel Dodge. So this is a painting of her, a portrait of her that was done by an artist, Nikolai Fuhe, I believe. And she was a Greenwich Village intellectual. So she had this this fancy apartment, 23 Washington Square, where she would host intellectual salons. And she would bring artists and leftists and academics and all these people together to kind of talk about radical ideas, but was this kind of wealthy patron. And so I started to kind of think about all of this in relationship to my role as a professor, as an artist, as someone with access to this historical collection, and started to see kind of parallels of like, how do you connect this sort of academic elite world with like kind of real life labor things. And so this sort of framework became really a driving force in the paintings. So I wanted to walk through some of the references that pop up in the paintings. So I'll just kind of go through them. Feel free to stop me if you have questions. And then I'll sort of set you loose in the galleries, and maybe we can do questions over there. If that sounds good, we'll just sort of be floating. Okay, so probably show this image on the left. So this was the starting point for one of the first painting I made for this show, and kind of the central painting for it. It is the poster from the pageant of the Patterson strike, which to me is like one of the weirdest things in this whole history. So the pageant was this, I'll call it a scheme that was in part invented by Mabel Dodge and some of these other kind of artists and Greenwich Village intellectuals. And the newspapers at that time were really effective at making sure that people either didn't know that this massive strike was happening across the water in Patterson, or making sure that people saw it in a very negative light. And so they were like, we need to get New Yorkers, we need to get New York laborers, New York intellectuals, New York wealthy folks on our side. And so they came up with this scheme to put on this giant pageant or play of the strike itself while the strike was actually happening. So the image on the right is from Madison Square Garden when the play was put on. The kind of buildings in the background are this massive scenic backdrop that was painted by John Sloan. And there's a script for the play that you can actually find online. It's a few acts. And the strikers themselves starred as the strikers. So it was this really kind of, wild like docudrama happening in live time while the strike was happening. And ultimately it wasn't a particularly effective tool. I mean, maybe in some ways, but it was a lots of money. They were hoping to like raise a bunch of money to support the strike. They ended up losing money on the play. And whether or not it was really a success in drumming up support, I think there are arguments both ways. But I found it, just an extraordinarily interesting way to approach another way of thinking about the role of the artist in these times. So this sort of backdrop you'll see is recreated in the paintings pretty directly. And then, in thinking about the role of strikes, of artists, of all of these things, so I started on this project largely over the summer, which of course was a time when there were tons of strikes. It was called Hot Strike Summer by the media. One of the major strikes that was happening at that time was the WGA strike, the Writers Guild of America strike in Hollywood. And I saw a lot of parallels between what those workers were striking for and what the workers at the silk mill were striking for, or sort of some of the drivers of the strike. Katya mentioned kind of expectations of increased efficiency or increased labor. So in the silk mills, they started to introduce new types of looms and technology that basically quadrupled the expectations of labor. And so this fear of technology, kind of rightful fear of technology making jobs harder or actually potentially taking away earnings, I thought was really parallel to what we're seeing a lot with AI, right? Companies are already sort of like predictively laying off people because they think AI will be able to do their jobs, right? And so this balance between introducing technology while balancing kind of labor rights, workers' rights is something that you can trace, throughout the history of labor, and in many ways felt very contemporary to me. So this image in particular with the little robo-dog holding the protest sign appears in one of the paintings as well. And then another kind of point of connection here for me in thinking about the Patterson strike is a relatively little known bit of history. So I grew up in North Carolina, just very close to Greensboro and Winston-Salem. So in 1979, there was an event in Greensboro called the Greensboro Massacre. And the result of this event was actually the first ever Truth and Reconciliation Council in the US. So it's a really interesting bit of history to dig into. It started with a group of out-of-state organizers coming in and working to unionize the textile mill in Greensboro that was largely staffed by Black workers. And these organizers, a lot of them were former academics who had left the academy to become full-time kind of communist labor organizers, so that was also an interesting connection for me. And as they were doing this organizing, they started to be more and more harassed by the KKK that was very active in Greensboro. And so in the midst of trying to unionize this textile mill, they also planned this anti-KKK march. They were attacked by members of the KKK and the American Nazi Party, and 5 people ended up being shot and killed. And the reason the Truth and Reconciliation Council was used is because the Greensboro police had a lot of advance warning that this was going to take place and did not warn the protesters, did not intervene. And so eventually, kind of admitted to their failings there and did the whole kind of reconciliation process. This links to an article that I think is so fascinating about how this particular event was one of the first times that the KKK and the Nazi Party kind of worked together, collaborated, which is something that we're seeing more and more in today's sort of far-right culture. So if you're interested in reading more, I highly recommend. It's a really good read there. So this image in particular, which is from a newspaper, from that article and from newspapers at the time, which shows one of the murdered protesters and kind of the discarded protest signs, also appears in one of the paintings. And then moving on to kind of the second painting that I made for this show, which is called El Lector. We're moving to Ybor City, which is located in Tampa. So Ybor City was an area that manufactured a lot of cigars, so kind of similar to Patterson. It was this sort of industrial area, particularly known for cigar manufacturing. And a practice that was really common in those factories. So these factories were very often staffed almost exclusively with Cuban immigrants, so Spanish-speaking workers. The image on the left is an active factory, and this guy who's on this kind of podium here is the lector. So the practice in these factories, and this it originated in Cuba and was sort of brought over by immigrants to Tampa, to Florida factories, is that you would have a lector who was elected by the workers and whose wages were actually paid by the workers. So they would not work on the cigar line, and everyone would kind of collectively pool to pay their lost wages. But that what they would do instead is read aloud to the workers. So this is kind of before radio times, but a lot of what they would read is kind of leftist political content. So it would be newspapers at the time, also like a lot of classic texts, but it was a way to keep people kind of engaged, and it also like really educated the worker population. And so then there was a lot of labor unrest. For similar reasons as there always is labor unrest, right? Arguments about wages and hours and all of these things. But one of the other central issues is that the cigar factory owners really wanted to get rid of the lectors because they were getting a little antsy, right? They were like, these people are starting to drum up some issues for us. And so they wanted to cut this practice, and people really got up in arms about that. So this is an image of a woman who's working at a cigar factory, and behind her is the lector. So portrait of this woman also appears in one of the paintings in the show, so you'll recognize her as well. This is this kind of emblem you'll see in the painting as well. So this is sort of an official lector card, so much like you had a union card. This was like a pretty prized role to be chosen by your fellow workers to kind of be the voice of the factory. So this is from a cigar worker in Ybor, Wilfredo Rodriguez. So another kind of connected event that happened in the Tampa area was the murder of Joseph Shoemaker. So if you follow this QR code, it takes you to an article about him and kind of this time period in Tampa, which is very interesting. So the image at the top left is the funeral of Joseph Shoemaker. So his casket is being carried by several men. He was a labor organizer in Tampa. He was working in cigar factories, and this happened in the 70s as well. And this image here, you'll recognize the kind of clan figure in the center, right here, shows up in the painting as well, as does this image. So this was particularly interesting to me because of, again, the kind of connection of the KKK and their role in really suppressing labor organizing in Tampa, right? So we often associate them with anti-Black and anti-queer movements, right? But they also were really worked hand in hand with police to suppress labor organizing. So Joseph Shoemaker was a labor organizer who was, along with several other people, kidnapped from his home, tarred and feathered, and then beaten to death. And this is the type of kind of like, I don't know if advertising is the right word, but whatever, you know, propaganda that you would see put out by the KKK to kind of drum up support for them against leftist, labor movement, communists, however you sort of wanted to label them at the time. This we're starting to get into kind of the third painting of the show. So this QR code takes you to this really interesting kind of docu-infographic video that the New York Times did recently on rooferitos, which is this subculture referring largely to hashtags, so hashtag rooferitos. A subculture of really young workers, typically undocumented Hispanic men, who are, you know, sometimes as young as 14, who are roofing houses in the U.S. With very little protection for them. So safety equipment, you know, training, things like that. So a lot of these boys have started to kind of document that life on TikTok, and as a result, these companies and these construction companies who are using their labor, it's just coming to light a little bit more. So the image on the left is one of the rooferitos who's gone like a little bit more viral, an image from him. And then on the right is a young undocumented worker who was working at a poultry plant in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and died as a result of an injury he sustained while cleaning one of the machines used to process the poultry. So I believe he was 16 when he died. So he was working there. He should not have been working there. It was illegal that the company hired him. And so you know, a lot of labor protections. You know, even where the protections exist, they are not enforced and not always available to all populations equally. So starting to think about, yeah, what that looks like in the present day, kind of what industries that exist in, and tying also child labor into it. So I think, yeah, this next slide. So this is the base for that painting, and also like a little bit of insight into the process. So a lot of these start with a kind of a very straightforward acrylic painting of poster, kind of, this is a political cartoon. This is, so you can see the mills that kind of Katya showed in the beginning. So this is from the silk mills, and these are two young children who are working on the mills, and you have kind of like a fat cat standing here with his money bags. And the full political cartoon from this includes a quote from Bill Haywood, so that IWW organizer I showed at the very beginning, saying something like, "The true thief is he who steals the playtime of children." So the IWW was also really instrumental in trying to get child labor protection laws passed, a lot of which are now trying to kind of be repealed and rolled back by Republican legislatures across the South. Okay. I also wanted to show you, just to talk a little bit about process, I'm very proud of myself, made this extremely elegant animation showing all of the process photos I can find on my phone of this painting. So I work in layers, and a lot of things get pushed back and edited and changed over time. So this painting in particular went through a lot of, it was a bit of we had a tumultuous relationship, so it went through a lot of back and forth, so you can see kind of how things started to layer and develop. One thing I haven't touched on too much so far is kind of the use of pattern. And so some of the patterns in the paintings reference specific specific patterns, clothing, textiles. So in one of the pieces you'll see flame stitch, which is pulled from photos of the apartment of Mabel Dodge, so that Greenwich Village apartment. She had this really luxurious flame stitch wallpaper that I'm drawing from. This pattern kind of running around the edge of this painting is from Guaybara Cuban shirts. So if you've ever seen those white kind of beautiful linen shirts that have stripes of embroidery running down the front that are often worn by Cuban men, this pattern is pulled from an image of that. Yeah, so kind of goes through lots of changes, lots of things get scraped and added over time. And then I did want to just briefly mention sort of the design for the exhibition. So Katya and I were both really interested in moving away from kind of the white cube, as it's called, which means, you know, your very typical sterile white gallery space. That's something I like to do in general in my work, because I think it can kind of transport paintings into different spaces and times. And I'm obviously, you know, really interested in history, and so I think that kind of transportation of the viewer to somewhere else can be really interesting. So this is that image of Mabel Dodge's apartment that I was talking about. This little hint right here is the flame stitch that you'll see a little bit in the painting. And so you know, it has this sort of like, you know, 1910s luxe bohemian feeling, very different than a kind of sterile gallery space. You know, we've talked about the use of red throughout Blumer's work, kind of our associations with red in general. And so we decided to paint most of the gallery red, and then also use this really incredible wallpaper that's made by a company based in upstate New York. So all of the wallpaper that you see in the show is hand block printed, and so it's really like an incredible work of art on its own. They're called the Delphi paper hangings. And this is the particular wallpaper pattern that I chose. It's called the J. Moiré, and it's specifically designed to kind of mimic silk. So if you've ever held silk fabric in your hand and it sort of catches the light in this really like wavy and beautiful way, this wallpaper sort of mimics that. And of course, early like, you think about like old French palaces, right? Silk was actually used as a wallpaper. So it's also a little bit of nod to that connection of silk to wall hangings. Okay, I think that's all I've got. Does anyone have any questions before I sort of let you loose into the gallery space, and then we can chat more there if you want? Okay, go.
Into the gallery we go.
Into the gallery we go. Thank you all.